Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, First Lady, Mama Ngina Kenyatta, Deputy President, former Prime Minister, Speakers, Chief Justice, and the Chief of General Staff, family of President Moi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have my own condolences to convey to the family of the late President, but I also carry a lot of messages of condolences from around the world, from people who interacted with the President and could not get in touch directly with the family. This I will present to you at a later date. I first met Mzee Moi when he was Vice President. I was coming to the end of my first year at university, and I was job seeking. The year was 1972, July. I was struck by his humility. What crossed my mind then was that he stood like a soldier. He was very polite. He was surprised that I wanted manual work on a farm. Many years later, he reminded me of this meeting when I became reluctant to take up the London posting. He even reminded me of the ridiculous T-shirt I was dressed in that day. You have to believe that he really had a strong memory. Just in case you are wondering, that was a bright yellow T-shirt with black writing and a cup overflowing with beer. It was from East African breweries with the caption, "Have a nice day." At this, our first meeting, President Moi talked to me about the importance of education. He made me promise him that I would pursue my education to PhD level. I therefore was not surprised that he paid so much attention to education when he became president. If there is one thing this country owes to the late president, it is a debt of gratitude for his tremendous effort to build schools from primary schools, secondary schools, tertiary colleges, and to universities. I sat in the meeting with him and British officials when he sought help for the building of Moi University. And apart from everything else and the other support they gave, that government donated the Moi University Library, which at the time was the largest this side of the continent. When it was critical to encourage girl education, to encourage girls to stay in school longer, he promoted the education of the girl child, but he did not forget the boys. There is not enough time to enumerate all that he did in promoting education in our country, but his legacy here is completely secure, I dare say. As most of you will no doubt recall, soon after the late former president took over power, one of the enduring images was his lifting of stones building gabions to prevent umomonyoko wa udongo. He constantly talked and practiced tree planting to protect our forest cover. Nyayo T-zones were, to use his own words, to stop encroachment on forests. Among those, and I will not even talk about the ivory because that was well documented yesterday by His Excellency the President. Among those who communicated with him on wildlife conservation was the Duke of Edinburgh and Prince Claus of the Netherlands. I was privileged to be present at the Dutch Royal Palace when President Moi was awarded an honor for his conservation work. I wonder whether we will do one posthumously. President Moi was a serious advocate for the United Nations Environment Program. If he was addressing the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro or just addressing the UN General Assembly, he spoke of UNEP and its work. I followed it because my initial appointment as ambassador was as the ambassador to UNEP to replace the first one, big sister Margaret Kenyatta. He did not only believe in the environment, he lived it. For us in the Foreign Office, on foreign trips, we carried recordings of wildlife, football, and songs of praise for his downtime. Later, the National Geographic television channel helped us. I have only listed a few examples from this area, but the history is much richer than this. President Moi always made it known to us that if agriculture failed, the government budget could not be balanced. He was unhappy at the IMF insistence that Kenya stop supporting farmers by extension workers. This was part of the structural adjustment program and also part of the change in the political climate in the world after the fall of the Berlin Wall that saw any assistance to our type of economies not forthcoming while being accused of all manner of things and not actually calling the spade at a spade and agree that they were not giving any assistance. It's easy to accuse you of being corrupt when they don't want to help you. He was a serious farmer and put a lot of food in the national food chain to the end. President Moi was respected internationally, even by those who did not like his policies. He was as comfortable with Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher, John Major, as he was with Chancellor Helmut Kohl, President Francois Mitterrand, and later Jacques Chirac of France. And of course, all the Israeli leaders. Most of you will no doubt remember the quick response the Israeli government sent when the bomb hit Nairobi in 1998. I was particularly lucky to sit with President Moi in his many meetings with leaders in international meetings. Other leaders often came to consult him. In diplomatic terms, you know that if they are coming to you, they respect you and you are the boss. He also received envoys constantly, plus local ambassadors who requested to see him. He met intelligence chiefs from some of these embassies. Through diplomatic maneuvers, he stopped the American ambassador in the last 6 months of 1992 from talking about our elections. The Kenyans didn't even notice. This was done through a leader of a third country. The man was a consummate diplomat. On Christmas Day 1992, he sent a letter to the German Chancellor to restrain his ambassador in Nairobi from accessing our polling stations. Total success. When traveling through London, for example, the president was always sent a representative from the palace to receive him. He was also given full police escort and security, which was not always the case with other leaders. Her Majesty the Queen often talked about him. At the presentation of my credentials and many other meetings, the subject was always how polite the President of Kenya was. Mzee's patience helped Kenya have a place of respect on the world stage. In 1992, at the height of the American presidential campaign, we saw on the CNN that US Air Force was sending planes to Somalia, but landing in Nairobi. We had not been asked. The planes were already in the air. It was Saturday. I called the president in a panic. He was calm, and he told me to talk to the American representative. The American number 2 came to the office, and to cut a long story short, the military gave the clearance. When the planes landed, however, they were not carrying any food. So again, President Moi had to step in. He convened meetings of the World Food Program and other donors to collect food to take to Somalia. It now became our problem. The problem was solved. On the eve of the departure of the President of the US from office, that is George Herbert Walker, or simply known as number 41 from the White House, he called President Moi to apologize for this incident. We had been told to facilitate that call, and Moi was there expecting the call. But when the call came through, the operator simply refused to put him through. He said there was no longer President Bush in America. We didn't like that guy. He didn't know this was our friend. He refused to put him through. The Americans got in touch. I called the switchboard to rearrange, but I had to explain to the president. He laughed and promised to apologize to President Bush for the mishap. And then we had the Siad Barre issues. Some of you might remember, to say nothing of the Sahrawi problems, and Congo, where other leaders refused to come with us, and we thought we were going to perish in the Congo forest, when all the four who had agreed to go on a delegation to Badolite to see Mobutu, to ask him to share power, simply fell off the radar screen, and it became President Moi alone who actually went. One of the things that is not always mentioned is his tremendous effort to resolve the problem of the assets and liabilities of the old East African community. On the 15th of November, 1983, he was in Arusha for a long meeting. We thought we were going to come home the same day. Then Mwalimu said publicly in the meeting that na huyu mwenzangu anataka kurudi nyumbani. Moi bwana tusaidie, kaa hapa tu tumalize. We ended up sleeping in Arusha with no clothes to change into. But nevertheless, actually, we didn't need to sleep because the meeting ended at 1 a.m. with the border being reopened on the 16th of November, 1983. I took the notes. Then, the refugees. I covered a lot of meetings between UNCHR Director Mrs. Sadako Ogata and President Moi. Many years after she retired and became head of JICA in Japan, I was attending a meeting she was chairing in Kyoto. She stopped the meeting to ask after President Moi, remembering that she sometimes wondered if she ever thanked him enough for his understanding and support for refugees coming across Kenyan borders in the 1990s. She told the meeting about how courteous and supportive President Moi was to refugees and to our work. I was understandably proud to hear this appreciation. James Grant of UNICEF also always talked of Moi's great contribution to child immunization. In foreign affairs, for 10 years as PS, I spoke several times with the Comptroller of State House, Head of Public Service, the PS in charge of internal security, intelligence chief, and often with PS Finance, and also regularly with the President's personal assistant. Intelligence and security meetings were held regularly. I also had to speak to the President almost every day, at times extremely early in the morning because of his great interest in foreign affairs. Mzee Moi accorded me the honor of being his head of public service and secretary to the cabinet. By this time, I had a very good working relationship with my colleagues, the permanent secretary. I can tell you, Mzee Moi did not tolerate personal disagreements at this level. We just had to get on well and get on with the job. It was within this group and with the Chief of General Staff that if there was need to talk the boss out of something or convince him of something, a delegation was sent to him at 6:30 in the morning. He was always a step ahead, but would receive us sometimes in a very tense atmosphere. It was not always easy, but he listened and took us seriously. When I first joined this group on my appointment as permanent secretary for foreign affairs, early 1992, the politically noisy year, I was sent with 2 other people with a message to HE, as we refer to him. It was a very steep learning curve. We were to tell him that the fighting Maela, it appeared, was not ending and that the military was willing to step in to help. I happily went and was surprised when I found myself alone before the President. He listened to me silently and patiently. I promised enthusiastically to return the following day with my 2 colleagues. He said nothing. The police were able to contain the fighting by the end of that day. I didn't even notice. But I went back as I had promised the President. My 2 colleagues did not show up as they had told me. the president decided it was time to educate me. He explained what it meant for the military to come out and take over what police should do. A military coup or what? He asked me, and I shriveled. I was sent on several other missions, often with some colleagues, but somehow I ended up as the one to speak up. Soon I learned that some of my colleagues found it easier to send me on these rather dangerous missions because they understood the cultural background of our boss. He was not going to shout at a woman, especially one considered young enough to be his daughter. I also soon learned how to recognize signs of displeasure. If he called me Daktari, I was okay. Seli was my official name, so that was fine. If he received me with Lakwani, which means child, in his softest voice, I knew I was in deep trouble. If he was really angry with me or my message, he sent Joshua Kulei to tell me, or I just stayed away. I went underground until he looked for me. I did this a couple of times. But as senior civil servants, we worked closely, consulted each other, and made our work easier. We, in fact, became big consumers of intelligence, and we debated with each other every day on everything. But everything had to be confidential. Leaking of information was out of the question. So, although President Moi worked closely with politicians, he managed the affairs of state with his civil servants. Some ministers did not always appreciate this and gave us grief, but we could not tell them what we had been told to do. If you are a civil servant, you are well advised to stay out of controversy with politicians. He would quietly protect you if he knew you are being attacked unfairly, but he preferred that you did not pick up fights with politicians. Except on very rare circumstances, civil servants, except for those who worked at State House, were not found at State House in the afternoon. Civil servants took up the early part of the morning. Mid-morning to afternoon was left for politicians and other private contacts we didn't need to know. Mzee was very kind, but he could be very curly if one did not act professionally. One day in October 2002, it was agreed that in my little group of 6 people overseeing political power shift, that we should let the president know that his party was not doing so well. 3 of us went to see him. When we were let in, we faced a really hostile reception. I thought I could see smoke coming out of his ears. He said, yes. Then slowly I noticed his countenance change. Then he calmly asked me, Daktari, who did you come with? When I looked behind, I was alone. My colleagues had fled. I think he took pity on me, invited me to sit down, and I gave him the 2 possible speeches for Uhuru Kenyatta to make. One, if the election outcome was to be different from what the president expected, and the other, just in case things worked his way. He accepted the speeches, he put them in his cabinet, and then asked me questions about how we arrived at that. We had a long conversation. 2 months later, we were in Washington, and President G.W. Bush, number 43, asked him who he would be handing over power to. He calmly said, may the best man win. President Bush answered, what about may the best woman win? What is wrong with Sally? We all laughed. He told him she's not a politician. We knew, and President Moi knew, that we were there to help achieve a smooth transition with the help of our friends out there. When President Moi was sworn in for his last term in office, I drafted his speech on his instructions. The speech had only 5 paragraphs, 3 of them starting with the same phrase, "In this, my last term in office." His name was not also on the ballot paper in 2002. He was ready and prepared to hand over power. We worked hard on this. Even the much talked about house that he was supposed to be thrown out of, we prepared the papers, we took them to cabinet, but President Moi declined to accept the house. He insisted that although he had lived in the property for years, it was not his property. We were not careless. We looked after him. He just was always correct, and that is what those of us who worked with him saw. You know, we've always said he kept time, and I could tell you a lot of disaster stories about people who didn't keep time, including a minister coming late to a dinner for Margaret Thatcher, and we all knew, all the civil servants knew, at the next reshuffle he would be gone, and he did. He was a very successful foreign minister. President loved him greatly. He left immediately after the elections of '88. I was privileged to work with my former boss as an ordinary civil servant for 5 years, as an ambassador for 6 years, permanent secretary for 10 years, and his head of public service for 2 years. I will always remain grateful to him. I will always remain grateful to President Moi for his generosity, support, professionalism, and above all, respect. After his retirement, his doctor and the man he referred to as my brother, Honorable Charles Njonjo, and their families ensured that we all got together often. I learned a lot about him during this time. He remained completely gentle and polite to the end. Mzee's family should be proud of what a great father they had and for his contribution to this country that he so greatly loved and made tremendous sacrifices for. His legacy will ensure. Rest in peace, sir.